Boa tarde a todas e todos. A gente vai agora dar continuidade aos trabalhos dessa tarde. E com grande prazer, eu estou aqui para introduzir a conferência do professor Bart Cammaerts. A vinda do Bart ao Brasil, né, e ao PPG-Com da UFMG, ela foi planejada lá atrás, ainda em 2019, era para acontecer no começo de 2020, com o suporte do programa CapSprint, mas aí veio a pandemia, a gente teve vários adiamentos, até a gente ter a oportunidade agora de recebê-lo. Então, eu, Laura, professora aqui do PPG-Com também, que está, né, coorganizando o evento comigo, a gente está muito satisfeita de tê-lo e também de ter a professora Mídia Georgiou, que falou um pouco mais cedo com a gente aqui. Então, o título da fala de hoje do Bart é The Normalization of Neo-Fascism and Abnormalisation of Social Justice in Contemporary Political Discourse. E eu queria apresentá-lo brevemente antes de passar a palavra para ele, então. Então, o Bart Cammaerts é professor titular de Política e Comunicação e chefe do departamento de Mídia e Comunicação da London School of Economics and Political Science. Ele é ex-presidente da Seção de Comunicação e Democracia da Associação Europeia de Comunicação e Pesquisa e também ex-vice-presidente da Seção de Comunicação, Tecnologia e Política da IAM-CR. A pesquisa dele atual e também historicamente, né, tem uma trajetória nessa área de pesquisas sobre mídia, comunicação e resistência, com ênfase particular em estratégias de mídia de ativistas, representações de protesto na mídia, contra-culturas alternativas e também questões mais amplas relacionadas a poder e participação. Ele publicou amplamente e tem alguns livros recentes que incluem The Circulation of Anti-Austerity Protest, Youth Participation in Democratic Life e Mediation and Protest Movements. O trabalho do Bart é bastante conhecido aqui no Brasil, sobretudo por quem pesquisa ativismo, protesto e mídias alternativas. Agora eu vou mudar para o inglês, para poder, né, agradecer o Bart. So, Bart, I would like to thank you again for coming here, for insisting with us in making this happen. So thank you very much. And now I will pass to you, and later we will have a time for questions after the conference, as we did with Miriam. Okay?
Thank you very much, Carol. It's lovely to be here, and I'm also grateful for the invitation and to be able to share my research with all of you. And some of you have probably attended my seminars last week, which dealt more with my work and theorization of the relationship between media, communication, and protest movements, and social movements more in general, and obviously that also expands into social change. But I also have obviously myself a background in activism, and one of my kind of one of the kind of strands in my activism has always been anti-fascism, because I come from a city called Antwerp, where in the 1990s we already saw the emergence of a kind of neo-fascist party that started to gain electoral power, increasingly kind of at some point 24%, at some point even 33% of the popular vote in the city of Antwerp, and that also spurred my kind of activism in anti-fascist struggles. And so in this presentation, and maybe we can kind of take this opportunity to start with the slides as well, I wanted to very much focus on the one hand, a few mechanisms through which neo-fascism has been normalized in recent decades. But I will also argue in the second part of my presentation here that this goes hand in hand with an abnormalization of the contestations of neo-fascism and more generally the abnormalization of social justice struggles. And so to kind of briefly outline the structure of my talk today, I will first unpack, let's say, the neo-fascist discourse and outline 4 core nodes that are prevalent in what we could see as a more global neo-fascist discourse that is emerging, and that focuses on the one hand on ultra-nationalism and nativism. The second node would be the kind of establishment of celebration of hierarchy, of inequality and superiority, and that then also leads to a third node, which we could refer to as anti-intellectualism and the propagation of lies and conspiracy theories, and then fourth, a kind of anti-enlightenment and anti-democratic value system that underpins that neo-fascist discourse. We will subsequently unpack a few of the mechanisms that are central to the normalization of this neo-fascist discourse, and then I refer to the Gramscian notion of the war of position, and what I've also called the mediation opportunity structure. I will also refer to what we could call the politics of provocation, and link to that also a sense of victimhood that neo-fascist actors exhibit. Then also the role of journalists as either allies or as enemies of the people. And then also the power of, let's say, self-mediation and the politics of visibility that these neo-fascist actors are very prone to use and are very sophisticated in exploiting. And that refers obviously or relates to this mediation opportunity structure. And then finally, I will also unpack a few of the mechanisms of what I was telling about earlier in my introduction of the abnormalization of these social justice struggles. And I will refer here mainly to examples of the UK, but I'm sure, and we can discuss that in the Q&A, that a lot of these mechanisms are also prevalent here in Brazil and in other parts of the world, namely the so-called anti-woke culture war, and the use of moral panics and a kind of creation of an imaginary crisis around this. Then the kind of notion of cancel culture, and again linking this to victimhood, and then finally also the weaponization of the freedom of speech and the right and the assertion of the right to offend. So let me first kind of unpack these 4 nodal points of the neo-fascist discourse, and start with ultra-nationalism and nativism. And so one of the most important nodal points in the fascist kind of discourse and ideology is obviously an ultra-nationalism, but combined with a nativism. And so whereby the nativism strives towards the homogenization and espouses the view that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, as Casmude points out. And so both nationalism and xenophobic nativism constructs clear boundaries between the self and the other, between us and them. And so they both constitute what de Klein and Carpentier called ways of in-group, out-group differentiation that construct the identity of the people, where non-native serves as what Derrida calls the constitutive outside to the people. Okay? And so whereby nationalism constructs boundaries between different nations and rejects a kind of supranational level of governance, nativism adds race to the us-them juxtaposition, and it also thus represents very much a rejection of multicultural society, and even the kind of an impossibility of the existence of a multicultural society. And so, for example, as the Yale philosopher Jason Stanley in his book How Fascism Works, and I kind of draw a lot on his work in this kind of establishing these nodal points, he explains in great detail that this is often coupled also with a sense of nostalgia towards a glorious past when the nation was more homogeneous, more patriarchal, more heteronormative, and so, for example, here in Brazil, that could be seen, for example, in terms of the glorification of the dictatorship. But in the United States, we see this kind of Trump claim of "Make America Great Again," which refers to this kind of great mythical past when America was great and where we need to get to again. And so it is basically also a promise to bring back a past, a glorious past, a golden age, as Lakoff points out here. Similarly, in India, with Modi, we can see also how history becomes an ideological tool through which certain policies are being justified to restore a pure Hindu nation of past, which obviously never was, but also to preserve the hierarchies of the caste system. And that brings us neatly to the second nodal point in terms of a celebration of hierarchy, of inequality, and of superiority. And so we see here that this idea of inequality and privilege is not just positioned as inevitable, but also as desirable. As Saalfeld, for example, argues, the neo-fascism relies on a belief, and I quote here, on a belief in the necessity and legitimacy of institutionalized social and political inequality based on criteria such as nationalism, race, ethnic group, gender, personal achievement, and social background. So we see here how a Darwinian concept of nature is superimposed on politics, so that inequality, in a way, is positioned as unnatural. And as an unnatural state, as against the laws of nature. What Jason Stanley also points out in this regard is that these hierarchies of race between white and non-white, for example, are often masked within fascist thinking by hierarchies of worth, such as being deserving or undeserving of welfare benefits, being hardworking versus lazy, hardworking people and those lazy that are profiting of the state. And all this serves subsequently as a justification for the privileged and superior status of the dominant native in-group vis-a-vis various out-groups. And so what is also important to understand here is that this is also coupled to what Tanguieff calls differentialist racism, which is at the heart of fascist ideology. And that differentialist racism means that there is a juxtaposition between the in-group and the out-group as intrinsically incompatible. And so, again, stressing this ontological impossibility of an equal multicultural society. And so also this rejection of equality that also Billig in this quote talks about. And for example, if I take the example of that party that I talked about in my introduction, that started gaining a lot of votes, that neo-fascist party in Flanders, in the north of Belgium, there we see that the slogans are about protecting our people first. And obviously our people, even though we are talking also about a lot of people of color that have been born in Belgium, that do speak the language that that went to school they are not our people. So it's a very limited definition of what our people means. And obviously we see also examples of this in Italy, where Salvini uses the same slogan, Italians first. Another example of this is, for example, how in the north of Belgium, a differentiation is being made between the real Flemings or North Belgians, let's say, or Flamengos as in Portuguese. The real ones are actually white, and that refers to this differentialist racism. That even if you are born in Belgium, speak the language, are supposedly, according to their definitions, integrated, that you are still not able to be a real Fleming, that you are an allochtone, which in Greek, and that's also in the Dutch language, it's called like that. They are allochtones. And if you look at Greek, that means not from here. So there's an ontological impossibility in their discourse for people of color to be part of the people. Similarly, in terms of Trump's discourse, we see similar kind of rhetorics in terms of, for example, when some Democrat congresswomen who are from a migrant background started critiquing Trump, he kind of says, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which you come from. And obviously they were born in the US. So it's kind of this, again, consistently also activating this kind of also anti-communist tropes, speaking about if you're not happy here, you can leave, etc. The third nodal point that I wanted to talk about is anti-intellectualism, lies and conspiracy theories. Anti-intellectualism could also be linked to what Ruth Wodak, who did a lot of research in terms of Austria, calls the arrogance of ignorance. And so the rejection of the objective facts, the delegitimization of science, experts and expertise, which we, for example, also saw in the UK during the Brexit debate, where a current minister, Gove, literally said, experts, what do they know? And so a kind of delegitimization of experts that bring facts to the table that counter the kind of discourse of neo-fascism. And I'm not saying that Michael Gove is necessarily a fascist, but it also shows how, and I'll come back to that at the end, how mainstream right-wing politics has increasingly appropriated a lot of kind of neo-fascist tropes and tactics and discourses. So in that regard, we could also refer here to Guy Debord, the situationist artist, who talks about about the notion of détournement, of how the true has become a moment of the false, and Lakoff talks here also about the death of truth and giving rise to what could be called a beyond truth or a post-truth politics. One specific articulation of this denial of truth altogether can be found in the way that fascist political forces have always developed, distributed, and promoted a whole range of wild conspiracy theories which befit their worldview. And which also target their ideological or ethnic enemies. And a conspiracy theory is also something that, to quote Fenster, that either misattributes dominance to individuals or simply places blame for the ills of the world on individuals rather than underlying and structural causes. However, while the focus is often on individuals, at the same time, for example, George Soros the real targets are not individuals, but rather ethno-religious groups, ideological enemies, for example, Freemasons, Marxists, Jews, and more recently, Muslims. Also, the kind of conspiracy theory also works in a very insidious way, because it operates at a rhetorical level and is very argumentative. It is designed to disrupt common knowledge by providing those that want to believe in the conspiracy theory access to a secret alternative explanation to which only those that are in the know have access to. And that's why it's so alluring. And we also saw, obviously, recently in the kind of COVID crisis, how conspiracy theories have been very productive and have been circulating very widely. And kind of, we see here in terms of Kellyanne Conway, who at some point was spokesperson of Donald Trump, kind of articulating basically pure lies as, no, they are not lies. They are just alternative facts. And so some are also calling this bullshit politics. So Douglas Kellner, by making things up as Trump goes along, fabulating, exaggerating, dissembling, lying, bullshitting as a mode of discourse and as a way of lies. Again, referring to the society of the spectacle of Guy Debord, the true has become a moment of the past. And we can also see how, unfortunately, here in Brazil, Bolsonaro is a kind of somebody that has been consistently propagating and fueling a lot of conspiracies. For example, the lie that Obama was not born in the US, propagating anti-vaccine conspiracies, fanning anti-Semitic claims that Soros rules the world, or supporting assertions that climate change is made up by is a cultural Marxist conspiracy. And this also, to end, there is also a strong anti-enlightenment and anti-democratic value system that underpins all of this. Neo-fascist ideology is firmly embedded in a long-standing anti-enlightenment tradition, because a lot of the Enlightenment values obviously go against a kind of fascist value system, because they emphasize rational argument in public debate, promotion of democracy, maximization of participation, acceptance of not of freedom but also equality as equal political principles, the articulation of natural and inalienable rights, human rights, and a spirit of, let's say, universal fraternity, which also led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's not surprising that neo-fascist ideology is also very much anti-enlightenment. But what also happens is that neo-fascists, and certainly today, and that's where the neo maybe comes in, are often not always that open and straightforward about their anti-enlightenment and fascist worldviews. They tend to selectively cherry pick from Enlightenment values. For example, claim, and I'll come back to that later, claim the freedom of right to freedom of speech to be a bigoted racist. Use the ideal of liberty to deny non-natives their democratic and human rights, or deploy even feminist tropes against Muslims. And so in his analysis of contemporary anti-enlightenment thinking, Iko Mali exposes this fundamental contradiction. So whereas the idea of democracy was historically closely tied to Enlightenment values such as human rights and equality, liberal democracy today is flipped over and being used as an instrumental vehicle to attack and undermine democratic values. And as again Jason Stanley points out, fascists have always been well acquainted with this recipe for using democracy's liberties against itself. And some examples of this, where we see, for example, a gathering of anti-democratic neo-fascists in Europe with Marine Le Pen and Salvini. You can see there on a square in Italy. In this piazza, there are no extremists, there are no racists, there are no fascists. Our enemies speak of the past because they have no future. Or this kind of Facebook post of the leader of the North Belgium Fascist Party, Flemish Interest, reacting to a suggestion of Olivia Rutazimbwa to introduce a quota for people from a migration background on electoral lists. And it's already the case in Belgium that there's already quota for women on electoral lists in Belgium, so it's not as if this comes out of the blue. And she suggested to kind of expand this to people from a migration background, and on which the leader of the fascist party reacted. For these multicultural diversity ayatollahs, democracy itself is their greatest enemy. Similarly, we can also refer to in terms of anti-democracy, in terms of the delegitimization of judges and civil service. Here, Nigel Farage was one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign. Our enemy is the civil service. Our enemy is the people that have denied us the conclusion of the referendum result. And obviously, here again, we see how democratic institutions are undermined and delegitimated. Similarly, the American Bar Association concluding that US President Trump undermines the legitimacy of the courts. And so, moving on to discussing some of the mechanisms of how these ideas have increasingly become normalized in many countries. And one of the ways is by using what Gramsci called the war of position. And obviously Gramsci was talking in jail, being jailed by Mussolini, was talking about how from a left-wing revolutionary politics could not become dominant through the old school politics of what he denoted, or the metaphor he used, of a war of maneuver, like the Russian Revolution. And so he went against Lenin and Luxemburg and Sorel, and he said, well, no, we have to have a war of position. We have to work in Western Europe. This kind of revolution that happened in Russia cannot be achieved. We have to work through civil society. We have to work bottom up. We have to kind of work through media, through education, to make the left-wing counter-hegemony hegemonic, let's say. But it is paradoxically, I think, fascist ideology and practices that have been most successful in doing this slow-paced, grinding political cultural work that Gramsci is talking about. And in fascist ideology, actually, this is they are calling this meta-politics. We are doing meta-politics, which very much relates to this war of position. I've also kind of developed this notion of the mediation opportunity structure, whereby obviously mediation is deemed to be pivotal here, and mediation opportunity structure relates to how media and communication tools are central in making this possible. And for example, Ruth Wodak and Michal Kriskanovsky point out how the affordance of mediatization and self-mediation of right-wing populism are probably among the key reasons behind the upsurge and success of populist ideologies and views. However, I would also want to argue that there is kind of also a demand side of explanation for this. We could refer to grievances relating to the disproportional negative consequences of economic and financial globalization, increased tensions relating to the emergence of multicultural societies, as well as increased inequalities, insecurity, and fear. and also an offer that kind of exploits these, and obviously the media also plays a role in that. So it's a kind of combination of factors in which media and communication plays a role in terms of why this process of normalization have kind of been quite successful. So let's have a look at a few mechanisms here, a few discursive mechanisms. First of all, I would say, and this is a very problematic issue, and that is the politics of provocation that a lot of these neo-fascist leaders and actors use. And Wodak describes this as scandalization, or the strategy to, and I quote her, intentionally provoke scandal by violating publicly accepted norms. Bolsonaro, for example, saying that the dictatorship here was not successful enough. They should have killed more people. And this is kind of really pushing a button where everybody goes like. And so this breaking of supposed taboos and attacking so-called political correctness is designed to create drama, moral indignation, and controversy, which then subsequently translates into more clicks, shares, comments, opinion pieces, and editorials, after which the neo-fascist provocateurs swiftly move from the perpetrator into their preferred victimhood role. And so we see how there is kind of a victim-perpetrator reversal going on here, which we also sometimes we also often see with rapists, for example. And so we see how this aligns with a long-standing cultivation of victimhood amongst neo-fascists vis-à-vis mainstream society. And so the liberal, and also against the so-called liberal elite and all those that dare to criticize or contest the will of the people, which obviously the neo-fascist actors claim to be representing and embody. And so there's also here an acute awareness of the media logic and the business model of contemporary media organizations, and that goes for mainstream media as well as social media. And so these provocations and scandals, that is where the business model of mainstream media, as a result of digitization, is feeding off. It needs this emotional content, it looks for engagement. And so as such, we as anti-fascists, let's say, or reacting against these provocations, are also part of making those provocations more salient, moving them up, making them trend, etc. And that's something to reflect upon, obviously. We see here that that kind of at the same time, also journalists are either need to be kind of almost as laudatory PR machines. Think of Fox and Friends, Fox News, kind of being a kind of amplifier of the neo-fascist kind of discourse, or they are being positioned as enemies of the people. Trump's persistent attacks on the so-called dishonest media, or Viktor Orban's threats to either to the media or co-optation of media. And so we kind of see that Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, but Farage, they all do this kind of the lying media, the kind of ways in which journalists are increasingly positioned as enemies of the people. And this obviously then also leads to, for example, Reporters Without Borders saying that threats, insult attacks are now part of the occupational hazards for journalists in many countries. I would argue that that has, to a large extent, to some extent, always been the case, but I guess more so today. And here we also see this kind of provocative politics where neo-fascist leaders have perfected this new politics of visibility that also John B. Thompson talked about 17 years ago. So they are very apt at carefully managing visibility and self-presentation within the mediated arena of modern politics. Trump on Twitter, Bolsonaro on WhatsApp, Salvini on Facebook. And so they use also these affordances of social media to their advantage. And so using very much Facebook, for example, as a potent platform to campaign and establish emotional connection with the electorate by combining an everyday likable soft side, I'm like you, with a hard side when it concerns immigrants and so-called corrupt elites, in the case of Matteo Salvini, for example. Also, current, so Bolsonaro and his allies turning to WhatsApp in order to distribute lies, conspiracy theories, and smears about their opponents in a highly targeted and persistent manner. And this is also very much linked to what we could call today the concept of disintermediation. So where these social media platforms enable these actors to reduce the number of mediators between them and between the party, between the leader and the electorate. So no journalists asking annoying critical questions. We can communicate directly with our sympathizers. And this also ties in then subsequently with celebrity culture and politics being collapsed in many countries. So cutting out news agencies, directly communicating, as I said, giving the celebrity status of the politicians, and obviously because they are so prone to scandalization and to use these tools, it's not as if journalists are not paying attention. So these platforms become also news sources for journalists, and so they amplify these messages even further through the mainstream media, so that they also reach people that are maybe not following their Twitter account or are not in a WhatsApp group that is being used. And so we kind of see how in the past certainly in the beginning of his presidency, every tweet that Trump kind of farted, to put it disrespectfully, it was front page news in every country, on every newspaper and every website in the world. And I say certainly in the beginning of his presidency that kind of waned, and at the end he was thrown off Twitter. And that kind of opens up also a discussion about the ethical and the kind of social and democratic responsibility of these platforms that are making a lot of money of these neo-fascist actors, because obviously these algorithms that drive these platforms can also be considered as hidden affordances. And so algorithms shape our social relations and the content we see without being directly perceivable as such, as Buchner and Hellman points out. But these hidden affordances are obviously also accessible at a price. And so the whole business model of these social media platforms is geared towards matching the digital footprint of our sociability with advertisers, including now, it seems, political actors who are willing and able to pay for it. In other words, it now is not just the collective that decides what gets amplified to whom, but also those who have enough capital to pay for access to those algorithms to target individual social media users with very specific content, be it conspirational or conspiracy theories, be it kind of anti-immigrant discourses. And so we see how we had obviously the scandal of Cambridge Analytica, but we also see how, if we look, for example, again at the example of North Belgium and Flemish interest, because we see that they spend most of their kind of political campaigning money on social media platforms. So this opens then up, I would argue, an ethical debate in terms of to which extent these platforms are basically making millions and millions of dollars from actors that are actively trying to undermine democracy, democratic values, cohesion, social cohesion, etc. And we are now seeing more and more a debate kind of coming to the foreground in relation to this. We also see, obviously, a lot of these platforms starting to acknowledge that there is a problem there. But at the same time, a lot of these platforms like Facebook still hold to the idea that we are basically platforms, and just like a telephone company cannot be responsible for if somebody organizes a murder through the telephone, we also cannot be made responsible for the content that circulates on our platform. But that logic is starting to break down at the moment. Moving on to the kind of other side of the coin, let's say, because this normalization not only operates through this politics of provocation and through kind of exploiting these affordances on social media, but it also increasingly works at the level of abnormalizing the contestations against the neo-fascist value system, be it sexism, be it anti-LGBTQ discourses, be it anti-racism, etc. And here again we see a number of mechanisms that are being used, and so where the normalization of racist and fascist ideologies, as I said, goes hand in hand with a discursive war of position aimed at abnormalizing those that resist that normalization. Right? And so we see how woke or being woke was deturned, to again use this notion of Guy Debord, from a black vernacular or slang, let's say, in the US civil rights movement, into a metaphor for so-called oversensitive and militant social justice warriors. So in 1962, a black novelist called William Melvin Kelly wrote a piece in the New York Times entitled "If You Walk, You Dig It." And whereas Kelly did not necessarily define woke per se, it does signify the kind of way that black people in the US need to be awake and need to be aware and look around, because they are living in an essentially racist, white-dominated society, and certainly in the 1960s. And so he also prophetically warned for the misappropriation and subversion of the black slang by white culture. And so we kind of see also how this anti-woke discourse subsequently became an integral part of what in political discourse analysis is called semantic and ideological polarization. And so increasingly we kind of see that fighting fascism, fighting discrimination, fighting hate speech is not any longer a moral disposition, but rather is being positioned as a very dogmatic and highly ideological opinion, on par with other opinions, or not even on par, being positioned as a problematic opinion, as an ideological position. And so we see also how the creation of, or the production of moral panics and the production of deviance is being used here. And through the instigation of moral panics, fear, and a kind of imaginary crisis, which Stanley Cohen, in his famous study on moral panics, through a process of exaggeration, distortion, prediction of dire consequences, and symbolization of acute threat. These are the mechanisms that are being used to abnormalize, let's say, and to make anti-racism deviant. And so also we see how Cohen highlighted the pivotal role of the media and of what he calls moral entrepreneurs in turning something or someone or groups deviant. And also how this then serves to stigmatize certain groups and certain phenomena in a kind of more long-term process. Because this is not something, like I said, the war of position, this is not something that comes out of the blue. We also see that there has been, let's say, a prior discourse to this, and I already referred to that at some point, the kind of political correctness gone mad discourse. And we see, I mean, I did a discourse analysis on the anti-woke culture war that is currently being waged by the UK Conservative Party in the UK. And again, an example of how mainstream right-wing politics is increasingly kind of appropriating and using a lot of this kind of meta-political strategies that the extreme right and neo-fascism is putting forward. So if I kind of looked at I made a corpus of a number of texts, and we kind of see here how woke is being positioned and always linked to negative phenomena. Woke culture, woke opinion, wokeism, woke times, woke agenda, the woke elite, the woke mob, woke dogma, and so on. And so woke insanity, craziness. And so we see how this woke ideology is described here by Garrett, by an MP from the Conservative Party in a document called, made by the so-called Common Sense Group. And here we see Gramsci kind of coming to the foreground as destructive, totalitarian, divisive, negative, and anti-democratic. So in a way, the fight against racism, the fight against sexism, against anti-gay discourses or anti-trans discourses is positioned in itself as anti-democratic and divisive. Another example, advocates of Black Lives Matter and environmentalism, transgender rights are referred to as extreme cultural and political groups who adhere to intolerant woke dogma. So we could see here how the fight against exclusions and structural racism and sexism, etc., is positioned as aberrant, as politically deviant, and as going against the sovereign will of the people, against the common good. And this is what part of the creation of what could be called horizontal outgroups, because populism or right-wing populism tends to, or populism in general actually, tends to construct a vertical relationship between the people and an out-of-touch elite. What right-wing populism often does is also create horizontal outgroups like intellectuals, migrants, asylum seekers, critical journalists, who are not part of the people anymore. And so also by frequently associating woke with the word mob, it's also positioned as irrational, unruly, vindictive, all characteristics which the public consciousness associates with the word of a mob. And this is also then subsequently linked to, again, this notion of victimhood and of cancel culture. It is there's a pushback here. We can also see that the pushback against hate speech and against racism and sexism in the public space is consistently denoted as cancel culture, as well as that we see today that if in the public space you are voicing racist views, there are, at times at least, real consequences now. You can get fired, you can lose your job, etc. And so this again is then being contested as cancel culture and as kind of like, oh, we can't say anything now anymore because of political correctness gone mad, etc. Yeah? And so how this is also positioned is by using the kind of concept of your opinion. So that anti-racism is an opinion, anti-fascism is an opinion. And so we need to have agreement and disagreement. We need to have democratic debate. And so that means that there is a moral equivalence that is being constructed between a variety of opinions. And so disregarding the moral dimension of the fight against fascism, for example. And so the topsy-turvy nature of this discourse is also demonstrated through the way in which disagreement is only an entitlement and an exclusive privilege of the dominant group, not those that contest it. Because if you contest them, that's not allowed. Then you are canceling. If they contest, it is disagreement. It is a kind of, we see that also in these quotes, that disagreement is not tolerated and perceived deviation from the narrow truth path. And so that kind of, that is their disagreement with anti-fascism or anti-racism. And we kind of also see here how this victimhood is again being activated. If you disagree with these kind of anti-racist activists, you are stigmatized. You are brought before the court of woke opinion. There's a public kind of whipping or flagellation. You should wear the sackcloth and ashes, and your name should be degraded through the social media kind of media sphere. Victimization of dominant majorities. Why we could link this obviously also to the notion of white privilege, whereby those that contest racism are the problem, not those that are racist. And that is then linked obviously also to a weaponization of freedom of speech. That cancel culture is positioned as an acute threat to the freedom of speech, which, and this is not necessarily articulated literally, but more implicitly, that we are claiming, they are, let's say, not we, they are claiming the democratic right to be a racist, to be a sexist, to be a gay and transphobe individual. And so we kind of see here how GB News, which is a new news station in the UK, which claims to be an anti-woke news station, which has the ambition to become the kind of UK Fox News, aims to expose the growing promotion of cancel culture for the threat to free speech and democracy that it is. Again, turning the tables. Using civicness to claim the right to be uncivic. And so the woke movement is insidious, and at the end of the day, it is about respect and tolerance, this MP says. We should not demonize racists. We should teach students how to disagree in civil way, not to cancel or condemn racists. But that final part is the race. That's implied. It's not said. And then also we kind of see how some are more explicit in this regard and kind of attack hate speech laws and kind of are claiming the right to offend and kind of and this emanates again from the textbook of the extreme right and the fascist right, which has been doing this for years. Gavin Titley, a great colleague of mine, wrote this book, Is Free Speech Racist? ? And he, and I quote him, argues convincingly how the far right consistently generates free speech scandals which aim to, and I quote, to create the space for racist speech as a beleaguered expression of liberty and positions the dissemination of racist discourse as a contribution to democratic vitality. End of quote. Finally, how to combat this? And this is easier said than done, because as you see, the kind of meta-political struggle and battle that is being waged here is very complex and at different levels. Because protest, outrage, and resistance against this neo-fascism, or the kind of rise of this neo-fascism, and against this politics of provocation, against the kind of moral transgression, is integral to this neo-fascist communication strategy, because it feeds their interlinked discourses of victimhood, and it feeds also this anti-woke culture war. It is an integral part, as I said, of the fascist metapolitical war of position. The Guardian journalist Jonathan Friedland a few years ago summarized this conundrum of those that want to protect democracy and counter neo-fascism. And I quote him, "We face the choice between doing what is morally right and what is politically smart. When you're dealing with an amoral bigot in the White House," and he was of course talking about Trump, "those two things are not necessarily the same." And so we should reflect, as I've said, more on whether or how to avoid taking the neo-fascist bait, because there is race baiting going on. And because sharing a neo-fascist provocation on social media, for example, to critique it, still repeats this neo-fascist discourse, and it's instrumental in its circulation across social media platforms as it counts as engagement. And also, as also Lakoff, for example, points out, the kind of negation of a frame also amplifies it. So maybe we should kind of focus more on increasing media literacies to detect propaganda and fake news and be aware of strategies to avoid spreading it. Ways of raising a critical awareness amongst audiences and citizens. But we cannot just lay the responsibility at the doorsteps of citizens and of individuals alone, I would argue. We also have to question the business models and practices of these of media, both traditional and social media, who feed off controversy, drama and outrage. We need to question these business models and practices, and maybe ask to which extent we need to regulate these platforms. The catch-22 with this, however, is that not reacting to all of these neo-fascist provocation and policies is also not an option, as this would also feed the normalization and the trajectory towards a common sense. And that maybe brings us also to, and that also brings me to my main critique of how mainstream right-wing politics is kind of increasingly appropriating and adopting the kind of neo-fascist discourse and tactics. And we should maybe also ask to which extent media and social media should treat neo-fascist political actors in the same way as democratic political actors. Is something like impartiality, for example, desirable when confronted with neo-fascist party and anti-democratic politicians? Is fact-checking enough in the post-truth simulacrum world we seem to be living in today? Do we really need to hear two sides of the argument when it concerns climate change denial, birthing, or anti-vaxxing? Is it acceptable that companies such as Facebook and Google make billions from dubious political actors that use their platforms and services to spread hate, to undermine democracy and democratic values? And asking the question, I think, is also responding to it. We should indeed defend, and I quote here LSE professor, late LSE professor Karl Popper, we should indeed defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the tolerant, or else the intolerant will destroy tolerance. But we should do so in a manner true to democratic principles and human rights, but also steadfast and resolute in our defense of these principles and rights. This is, however, not only, I would argue, a moral duty for our hybrid information and communications systems, but as much for broader civil society and democratic politicians and parties, who together with media actors need to work harder to strengthen and deepen our democracy. But we also, importantly, need to address this demand side I talked about, which makes neo-fascist discourses and policies resonate with so many citizens across the world. We should also, I would argue, turn social justice struggles and anti-fascism back into moral dispositions rather than an opinion on par with its opposites. It is important to acknowledge that the current virulent anti-woke metapolitical war of position is also a testament to the relative success in recent years of anti-racist, anti-sexist, and pro-LGBTQ struggles, as it constitutes a forceful pushback against these recent successes. And I would argue that this pushback from the right and the extreme right has caught many activists who might have thought that their respective struggles for equality and social justice were by and large won by surprise. At the same time, identity politics in a highly polarized and hyper-mediated public space also has its own moral entrepreneurs and its own aberrations, which not surprisingly then get consistently amplified in the right-wing media as yet another example of so-called woke madness. In the society of the spectacle that we live today, it is often through a disproportional focus on the aberrations that moral panics are fed and the anti-woke metapolitical war of position is being won. But one thing is certain, at least for me, racism and fascism, the anti-racism and anti-fascism are not and should never be opinions worthy of open debate. On the contrary, I would argue, because this slogan, in a way, puts it in a very short way, no pasarán. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bart, for this inspiring conference. I think we kind of can relate to so many of your points because we are living that, and we kind of can see in our everyday lives everything that you are talking about, and the same strategies, of course, in some specific ways, but yeah, we can greatly relate to all that. So before we pass to the questions, I just want to thank Luis Coutinho, who is a PhD candidate here at UFMG, and he has helped us a lot with this conference in terms of technical support, and also for translating your slides. He did a very good job. So thank you very much, Luis. And yeah, I think it made it easier to kind of understand all the points. So yeah, let's pass to some questions. I think people could send us through the chat in Portuguese or in English, and we can kind of start a conversation. Everybody's clapping, sending claps here. I can see that. Yeah, it was great, really great. So maybe I can do the first question while people just kind of start to think. But I think your last points are very interesting, how we can think about and find strategies to deal with neo-fascism and all these strategies and mechanisms that the alt-right is using. And I was wondering about the strategies that the political actors like the leftist and the leftist parties, the progressive parties, how they could deal with that as well. You were talking about things that we kind of can do as researchers, intellectuals, and people that are working with media and researching media. But I was wondering if you have thought about some of the strategies that the progressive parties could use, because I think we have a lot of people that are questioning how the leftist parties are actually dealing with all that, how they kind of are not very able to use the same type of tools and functionalities in the way that the alt-right is using. So yeah, my question would be in this direction.
No, great question, and indeed I didn't quite relate to that. First of all, I would stop using alt-right because that is in itself a metapolitical concept that has been put forward by fascist groups, and that's why I've been consistently calling it neo-fascism and not alt-right, because alt-right kind of in a way serves to sanitize what they are about and what kind of political ideology they are, and so that's one thing. But on a more kind of substantive note, I think we need to kind of look again at one of my final points that I made in terms of the demand side, and reflect on why is it that so many voters feel attracted to the discourses and to the politics and to vote for these kind of people. And then obviously we are kind of looking at a lot of people that feel left behind, a lot of people that for which globalization does not work, for which neoliberalism does not work, and who are left behind, and for whom kind of we also see a kind of race and class as two identities that have been pulled apart, and so there is kind of work to be done to reconstruct an intersectional meta-narrative that brings these back together, and that won't be easy, because obviously this juxtaposition and this kind of us-them thinking is very strong and very powerful, but that needs to be broken. The kind of us category, let's say, needs to have more alliances again between different groups that feel left behind and different agendas. And then we kind of come to a final point, which is a controversial point, and I don't know whether I necessarily agree with it fully, but somebody like Chantal Mouffe, for example, who is also a Belgian, has argued for the need of a left-wing populism, and that is obviously something which here in Latin America has a very long tradition and a very long history, and that is, like I said, is about constructing this horizontal relationship between a kind of privileged, out of touch elite and the people, but in a much more inclusive way. So an articulation of the people in a much more inclusive way, not kind of taking out or bringing race into that kind of debate. And yeah, so I would kind of, but there are also issues with that, obviously, in terms of it's a kind of simplification of politics, which obviously works very well from the right wing. I don't know whether that kind of simplification works that well from the left. And so, yeah, that's a debate to be had there. But if people are interested, look at the work of Chantal Mouffe. She even wrote a little book about it, about left-wing populism. And then she referred, obviously, to things like Podemos in Spain, for example.
Great, thank you, Bart. So we have a question by Larissa Rodrigues. So she's asking, considering what the professor said about how neo-fascist people many times claim leftists are canceling them and hide themselves on the freedom of speech argument, is there any hope for debate in media or even with one-on-one dialogue to persuade the people who have these beliefs?
First of all, from a theoretical perspective, dialogue is something different than debate. Dialogue we can position much more in a kind of Habermasian deliberative kind of context. Debate is more about conflict. But having said that, I find it personally, I mean, for me, and that kind of goes to the kind of way in which that anti-woke and that cancel culture discourse is kind of pulling us in the direction of kind of saying, oh, there are different opinions and there is disagreement and agreement, and that basically puts anti-racism on the same level, or anti-fascism on the same level as fascism, or anti-racism on the same level as racism. We can have a debate there. No, we can't have a debate, as far as I'm concerned, because these are, for me at least, and that's what we should try to kind of reestablish, they are moral dispositions. So racism, I cannot have a debate with a fascist, because it won't be a debate. It won't be a kind of exchanging arguments that are for me on a level playing field. And that is where we should get back to, and not do as if we can have a civilized discussion with them about xenophobia or racism or kind of sexism. No, it's not about. It's about struggle. It's not about having debates, I think.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yasmini is saying it's thank you for the conference. She said that was really inspiring. And she's saying that I'd like to know what do you think about politics from left parties often discredit personalities like Greta Thunberg, saying she's too extreme about her climate activism. It's usual to see politicals from the right parties, but her discourse also, she's posting.
Yeah.
But her discourse also not well seen from left parties too.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question, and that brings the environment and environmental issues into the debate. And obviously, the left is a broad school, and obviously there is a kind of, let's say, green-red kind of constituency within the left that does acknowledge the issues with climate change. Now, there is obviously also an issue there, because some forces from the left, and certainly within unions and worker rights and kind of working class kind of concerns that are not very much in line with this kind of environmental agenda. And the problem there, to some extent, is that, and that's also a problem for the environmental movement and for these young activists, that they fail to connect with working class people often with their green agenda. And although they have a kind of Green New Deal discourse, they have a kind of intersectional, but that's often more performative than embodied. And they also often fail to resonate with people of color in many countries, or communities, or immigrant communities, for example, that are not really on board with this kind of environmental agenda. And part of the issue there is that a lot of the kind of green policies are hitting poor communities disproportionately hard. And so if we see, for example, the Yellow Vest movement in France, which is a very ambiguous movement, but was basically a working class, lower middle class reaction against a green tax of increasing petrol with a kind of environmental argumentation, where you kind of see that there are tensions there, and tensions that need to, that the environmental movement also needs to acknowledge and think of how to resonate with poor communities, with working class communities, etc. And so that is the challenge, and that is also the reason why I think there are also critiques from the left towards environmental politics as being elitist, as being out of touch, as not kind of being as aware of the kind of inequalities that a green politics often also induces.
Okay, so thank you very much, Bart. I think we can finish here. And yeah, it was great to have you here. The seminars last week and now, I think we closed it in a very great way. The conference was excellent, and I think it actually dialogues with everything that's going on here in Brazil. So thank you for this, and thanks for making the effort to kind of relate to our contest as well. It was great.
My pleasure. I'm glad it was also useful for all of you. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye. See you.